Adolf Hitler, a name that would become infamous in history, began life in an environment far removed from the global chaos he would one day unleash. To understand how his early years shaped his character, it is important to look closely at his childhood, not with admiration or sympathy, but with the intent to understand how the conditions of his upbringing may have influenced the course of his later life. He was born on April 20th, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, a small town on the border of Austria and Germany. The town itself was modest, a quiet place that looked out across the River Inn toward Bavaria. His father, Alois Hitler, worked as a customs official. He was ambitious, proud of his position, and expected obedience from his children. Alois was in his 50s when Adolf was born, already a man with firm habits and a strict approach to family life. His mother, Clara, was more than 20 years younger than Alois. She was gentle, deeply caring, and protective of her children. Between the two parents, Adolf grew up in a household that balanced severity and tenderness, though the dominance of his father often overshadowed the warmth of his mother. Adolf was one of 6 children, though not all survived infancy. In an era when disease and poor medical care were common, childhood mortality was high. Adolf's early awareness of death within his family created an atmosphere of loss. His attachment to his mother grew stronger with each loss, while his father's strict and sometimes violent discipline became a source of tension. From the beginning, Adolf seemed to embody a conflict between tenderness and rebellion, between the desire for approval and the resistance to authority. As a small boy, Adolf was not remarkable. Neighbors and family acquaintances remembered him as quiet, sometimes withdrawn, but capable of sudden enthusiasm. He played in the streets with other children, yet often preferred solitary activities. His imagination was vivid. He liked drawing and daydreaming, and he was fascinated by heroic tales and grand architecture. Even before formal schooling, his tendency to drift into his own world was noticeable. His parents sometimes worried about his habit of staring into space, as if caught in deep thought. Education began with promise. In primary school, Adolf did well. Teachers noted his intelligence and ability to learn quickly, especially in subjects that captured his interest. But this early promise did not last. As he grew older, school became a battleground between his father's expectations and his own desires. Alois wanted his son to follow in his footsteps, perhaps in civil service or another stable profession. Adolf, however, had little interest in such paths. He was drawn to art, to the idea of becoming a painter or architect. The clash of wills between father and son intensified as Adolf moved into adolescence. At school in Linz, Adolf's performance began to decline. He resisted subjects he found boring and openly challenged authority. His grades fell, and his teachers began to see him as lazy and undisciplined. Yet in certain areas, such as history and art, he continued to show enthusiasm. He was particularly fascinated by the idea of German history, myths of national greatness, and the legacy of empire. In these areas, he could lose himself for hours, imagining a world much larger than the one he inhabited. The family environment also shaped him profoundly. Alois was often domineering. He demanded obedience and sometimes resorted to corporal punishment when his children defied him. Adolf, who shared his father's stubbornness, clashed frequently with him. These conflicts left the boy resentful and determined to resist the path laid out for him. By contrast, his mother Clara doted on him. She comforted him after arguments, supported his artistic dreams, and softened the harshness of Alois's discipline. This imbalance created a powerful attachment to his mother, one that would define his emotional life for years to come. Tragedy struck in 1903 when Alois died suddenly of a lung hemorrhage. Adolf was 13 years old. For him, the loss was complicated. On one hand, it removed the figure who had pressured him toward a career he did not want. On the other hand, it left the family financially strained and emotionally unsettled. The absence of his father deepened Adolf's reliance on his mother, whose influence became central in the years that followed. Without his father's authority, Adolf's schooling deteriorated further. He drifted, unwilling to commit to the academic disciplines that might have opened professional doors. His dream of becoming an artist solidified during this time. He sketched buildings, landscapes, and imagined grand structures. Teachers who reviewed his work acknowledged talent in drawing, though not enough to guarantee a future in the competitive world of art. Still, Adolf held to his vision, believing that he was destined for something greater than the ordinary careers that had defined his father's life. In 1907, another devastating loss struck. His mother, Clara, died of breast cancer after a painful illness. Adolf was 18 at the time, and her death left him adrift. He had adored her, and her passing was perhaps the single greatest emotional blow of his youth. Without her protection, he was alone in the world, with little money and no clear path forward. The grief he carried from this loss would remain with him, shaping his relationships and sense of security for years to come. After his mother's death, Adolf moved to Vienna, the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, determined to pursue his dream of becoming an artist. He applied to the Academy of Fine Arts, but was rejected. His drawings, while skilled, were judged insufficiently imaginative. A second attempt also failed. For a young man who had placed his hopes on art, these rejections were crushing. Vienna became a place of disappointment and survival rather than triumph. In the city, he lived in men's hostels, cheap and crowded accommodations for those with little income. He tried to make ends meet by selling sketches and watercolors, small works that earned him just enough for food and rent. His clothing was worn, and his existence was precarious. It was during these years that Adolf experienced real poverty, a stark contrast to the structured life his father had once tried to impose. Yet Vienna was more than just a backdrop of struggle. It was also a city teeming with ideas. Politically, socially, and culturally, Vienna in the early 20th century was a crossroads of empire, filled with different nationalities, languages, and religions. For some, it was a place of rich diversity. For others, it was a source of tension and prejudice. Adolf absorbed these tensions. In coffeehouses and on the streets, he encountered strong nationalist rhetoric, anti-Semitic propaganda, and debates about the future of Austria-Hungary. As a young man with no steady job and no clear future, Adolf was susceptible to these influences. The disappointment of his artistic failures, combined with his financial hardships, made him more receptive to ideologies that offered simple explanations for complex problems. Vienna provided an environment where resentment could take root, though at this stage of his life he was still just another struggling young man, more focused on surviving day to day than on shaping history. Those who knew him in the hostels remembered him as reserved, but capable of speaking passionately when roused. He remained interested in art and architecture, often drawing buildings and imagining urban projects. He also continued his fascination with German nationalism, romanticizing the idea of a strong, unified Germany. These elements, still scattered and undeveloped in his youth, would later crystallize into the dangerous beliefs that fueled his rise to power. Looking back on Hitler's childhood and youth, what emerges is a portrait of a boy caught between tenderness and harshness, between ambition and failure, between dreams of greatness and the harsh realities of loss. His upbringing did not predetermine his later actions, but it created the foundation on which his adult personality was built. The authoritarian father, the nurturing mother, the school struggles, the artistic dreams, the devastating rejections, and the exposure to prejudice in Vienna. All these elements combined to shape the young man who would eventually step onto the world stage in the most destructive way. By the time Hitler left Vienna for Munich in 1913, he was 24 years old. His childhood and early adulthood had been marked by poverty, frustration, and loss. He was far from the dictator he would become, but the seeds of his worldview had already been planted. Understanding these formative years is essential, not because they excuse his later actions, but because they remind us that even the most destructive figures in history begin as children shaped by family, environment, and circumstance. Hitler's childhood story is therefore not just a personal history, it is a cautionary tale. It shows how disappointment, hardship, and toxic ideas can combine in dangerous ways, and it underscores the responsibility of societies to provide guidance, opportunity, and resilience for young people, so that anger and resentment do not fester into something far more destructive.